The sound came first, a metallic scream that rolled across the lagoon like thunder on steel. Then came the sight of it, a sheet of glinting metal thrown down by sweating Seabees, locking into place with a ringing clang. The Pacific sun beat down hard on their backs as they worked, each man knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, a war waited for this very moment to begin. It was 1943, and the United States was running out of islands. Every new campaign, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, required the same impossible miracle. Turn a patch of coral, jungle, or volcanic ash into a runway long enough for warplanes to take off within days. The fate of entire operations, of fleets and thousands of men, depended on whether engineers could create an airfield faster than the Japanese could destroy it. And in the middle of this desperation came a strange invention, a steel mat that could turn mud into tarmac, chaos into strategy, and small islands into springboards toward Tokyo. They called it mat, though to the men who used it, it went by a dozen names. PSB, pierced steel planking, the steel carpet, the iron field. It was ugly, heavy, and loud, a simple idea made of blood and ingenuity. But it would change the Pacific War forever. The story of Mat begins not in the tropics, but in the red clay of Alabama. In 1939, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers faced a question that seemed almost absurd at the time. How do you build an airfield in a place that has no roads, no concrete, and no time? The answer came from a small airfield in North Carolina, a test site called. Engineers there began experimenting with portable runways, interlocking steel panels punched with holes for drainage and traction. They were originally meant for training grounds, a temporary fix for aircraft bogging down in mud. But when the United States entered the war, the temporary idea became vital. The Army Air Forces needed landing strips that could be built on beaches, jungles, and coral reefs. Concrete was impossible. Asphalt melted under tropical heat. What they needed was something that could be shipped, assembled fast, and hold the weight of a bomber. Enter the mat, a 5-foot by 15-inch section of perforated steel, stamped with rows of circular holes and ridged for strength. Each piece weighed about 66 pounds, with hooks and slots that allowed them to lock together like puzzle pieces. Thousands could be shipped in stacks, then spread across the ground like an iron carpet. Simple, brutal, brilliant. On paper, it worked. In reality, it demanded everything from the men who laid it down. Private Robert Keane of the Seabees later said, "We didn't build airfields, we forged them." Imagine it, an island freshly taken, still smoking from bombardment. The coral churned to dust, the jungle shredded. The engineers landed with the second wave, carrying nothing but shovels, bulldozers, and stacks of cold steel. There were no maps, only orders. Get a runway down by morning. In the heat, the air shimmered. Mosquitoes swarmed. The smell of oil and death hung thick. And through it all, the clang of metal on metal echoed across the beach, thousands of mats being dropped, aligned, and hammered into place with sledgehammers. Each panel had to fit perfectly. If one edge lifted, a landing plane could tear its landing gear off. If mud built up underneath, the whole section could buckle. The men worked barefoot sometimes, the metal too hot to touch, their soles blackened with oil. One engineer remembered watching fighter planes circle overhead, waiting for the signal to land, on the very runway still being built beneath them. The pressure was beyond anything they'd trained for. Each hour meant lives, each mistake meant wreckage. And yet somehow they did it. The first great test came at Guadalcanal. When U.S. Marines captured the Japanese airstrip there in 1942, they found it a mess of mud and cratered ground, almost unusable. Every rainstorm turned it into soup. The Marines needed the airfield fast, or they'd be isolated and slaughtered. The Seabees arrived in the dead of night with crates of steel planking. They worked through rain and shell fire, sometimes laying mats while Japanese artillery zeroed in on the flashes of their welding torches. By dawn, the runway stretched just long enough for a squadron of F-4F Wildcats to land. One pilot said later, "It felt like landing on a battleship deck, rough, short, but solid." From that moment on, Mat wasn't just equipment, it was salvation. Soon, the steel sheets became a symbol of American persistence. Everywhere the U.S. advanced, from Tarawa to, they carried those strange perforated panels with them. Ship holds were packed floor to ceiling with them. Landing craft dropped them off by the ton. Some soldiers even joked that the war could be won simply by covering Japan in steel mats until it surrendered. But behind the humor was awe. Because the mat wasn't just a runway, it was infrastructure incarnate. It allowed engineers to build supply depots, tank parks, bridges, docks, anything that needed a solid surface. It turned swamp into structure. It gave air power to islands that were nothing more than specks on a map. And it wasn't only the Americans who noticed. The British adopted it, the Australians. Even the Soviets used versions of it after 1943. In every theater, the same clang of steel echoed across the world, a sound that meant progress, mobility, and a new kind of warfare built on logistics rather than land. But for all its genius, the mat was unforgiving. Men lost fingers between panels. Tropical rust ate through stacks left in the rain. The steel baked under the sun until it could blister skin. In the dark, it turned treacherous, slick with oil, rain, or blood. Yet it endured. By 1944, it had become the very foundation of the Pacific Campaign. It enabled island hopping, the leapfrog strategy that bypassed heavily defended Japanese strongholds in favor of capturing strategic airfields. Without Mat, bombers like the B-24 and fighters like the P-38 couldn't have reached the next island. The entire plan, from MacArthur's march to the Philippines to the raids on the Japanese home islands, depended on those steel planks. To build a runway fast meant bringing war faster, and with every clang of metal, the end crept closer. One evening on a coral atoll in the Marshall Islands, an engineer named Jack paused mid-swing, hammer in hand. He watched the horizon glowing orange, tracer fire, and burning wrecks. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Around him, his crew laid the last rows of mat under flickering lanterns. "Feels like we're building the road to Tokyo," he muttered. His sergeant, without looking up, said quietly, "We are." The wind carried the sound of hammers into the dark, a strange music of war, rhythm and metal, determination and fatigue. By the time the sun rose, a new runway stretched across the island. The first P-40 landed before breakfast. Within a day, the airfield was alive, bombers taxiing, mechanics shouting, jeeps rattling over steel. For the Seabees, it was another miracle finished. For the pilots, another island conquered. For the war itself, one step closer to its brutal end. By the summer of 1944, the mat had become more than a tool, it was a philosophy. The Pacific War wasn't fought over cities or borders. It was fought over airfields, temporary, replaceable, but essential. Whoever could build them fastest won. And so, the United States became a nation of builders at war, constructing runways in days where once it had taken months, turning hostile jungles into, and paving the path toward Japan with sheets of steel. Every clang, every weld, every blistered hand carried the same silent promise: where we land, we stay. The dawn light broke over a landscape of smoke and salt. Tarawa, November 1943. The air reeked of cordite and death. The island was barely 2 miles long, a strip of coral sand that had cost over 1,000 American lives to capture. But now, before the blood was even dry, the Seabees were already there, unloading crates, rolling bulldozers off landing craft, shouting over the crash of waves and the distant thud of mortars still echoing inland. Their mission was clear and cruelly simple: build an airfield before the next tide. The beach was chaos. Burned-out Amtraks littered the sand. Corpses still floated in the shallows. But the engineers didn't stop. They had learned that the best way to survive was to move, to turn destruction into order before it swallowed them whole. From the decks of LSDs came the sound that would define the Pacific War, the clang of mats being dropped into the surf. Each one a rectangle of pierced steel, shining wet under the rising sun. Teams of men worked knee-deep in mud and seawater, dragging panels into place. They laid them directly over coral and sand, locking each one with the next using long iron pins. The process was brutal, everything about it resisted them. The panels slid, the mud sucked at their boots, the waves crashed in, knocking them over again and again. Private Joseph, a Seabee with the 18th Naval Construction Battalion, wrote in his diary that night, "The steel burned our hands, the salt burned the cuts, but the planes were coming tomorrow, and if we didn't have a strip ready, those planes had nowhere to land." They worked for 36 hours without sleep. When the first Marine Corsair landed, its tires smoking as it hit the new runway, the men cheered. They had done the impossible. Tarawa was barely secure, but already it had become a fortress, thanks to that glittering carpet of steel. From Tarawa, the lessons spread. Each new invasion improved the choreography. The engineers became faster, more precise, almost mechanical in their movements. In the Gilberts, they learned to anchor the mats with coral gravel. In the Marshalls, they discovered how to float sections of runway directly off barges and push them onto shore. On Saipan, they built 3 complete airfields in less than a month, and each made of the same humble steel planks. And everywhere they went, the same sound followed them, that metallic percussion that became the heartbeat of the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Harold Red, a Seabee officer, described it best. "We weren't fighting the Japanese half the time, we were fighting nature. Heat, salt, rain, coral, jungle. But Matt didn't care what it sat on. You could throw it on a swamp or a volcano and it would still hold an airplane." He wasn't exaggerating. At Atoll, the engineers laid Matt directly over coconut trunks to create a floating runway that wouldn't sink into the sand. At Kwajalein, they covered coral rubble so uneven it shredded their boots. And at where the volcanic ash swallowed everything, they discovered a trick, digging shallow trenches and laying the steel sheets like ribs to keep them from sinking. The result was always the same. Within days, planes landed where days before only chaos had reigned. In many ways, the Seabees were waging a different kind of war, a war against time. The faster they could build a runway, the faster bombers could launch to support the next invasion. The faster they could repair damaged airfields, the faster wounded men could be evacuated. Every minute counted, every delay meant lives. One construction officer had summed it up. "If you want to know what pressure feels like, try paving an airstrip while a fleet is waiting to launch from it." Was where the Mat reached its greatest triumph. The island, once a quiet sugar plantation, became the largest air base in the world. The Seabees turned it into an industrial landscape of steel and concrete. At its peak, it hosted over 500 B-29 bombers, the very aircraft that would later carry out the firebombing of Tokyo, and ultimately the atomic missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It all started the same way it had on those first beaches, with a shipload of steel mats and a handful of exhausted men. Over 125 million square feet of mat were used in the Pacific alone, enough to pave more than 4,000 football fields. Every piece had been manufactured back home in American mills, stamped, punched, and shipped halfway around the world. Each plank carried the mark of the war industries: Bethlehem Steel, Republic Inland, U.S. Steel. And each one told the same story, that the war could be won as much by building as by fighting. But as the mats spread across the islands, something strange began to happen. The very landscape of the Pacific began to change. Aerial photos from 1944 show hundreds of small islands that once had nothing but jungle and beaches, now gleaming with silver runways that stretched like scars across the earth. Some islands had multiple strips, one for fighters, one for bombers, one for transports. Others became temporary cities, complete with maintenance hangars, fuel dumps, and living quarters, all built on steel floors that rang under every footstep. At night, when the generators came alive, the glow of floodlights reflected off the metal like water. Pilots said you could see the runways from 50 miles away, thin silver lines cutting through the dark. To the Japanese, they were a nightmare. To the Americans, they were a promise: we can build anywhere. By now, the Seabees had turned their work into an art form. They had teams who could assemble 1,000 feet of runway in a day. They carried blueprints not for cities, but for mobility itself. When a plane crashed and tore up the steel planking, they replaced it within hours. When a typhoon ripped across an airfield, they relayed it by hand. There was no glamour, no glory, just sweat, noise, and the smell of oil and rust. The pilots, though, never forgot them. A bomber pilot named Captain Ray Fisher once said, "When you come in low and see that steel strip gleaming below, you feel like someone's already won half the war for you." He wasn't wrong. Every successful landing, every rescue, every strike launched into enemy territory, all of it rested on that iron foundation. Without the mats, the planes would have had no place to call home. And yet, for all its utility, the mat carried an eerie beauty. When it rained, the holes filled with water, turning the runways into mirrors that reflected the sky. Birds landed on them. Soldiers sat on them to eat or sleep, their reflections shimmering beneath them. Some men even carved initials into the panels, knowing they would outlast them. There was something almost poetic about it, a skin laid over the earth, connecting distant islands through a shared rhythm of steel and sweat. It was said that when you walked barefoot across a newly built runway, you could feel it hum, the vibrations of the Pacific itself passing through every piece. By early 1944, the American advance had become unstoppable. The Navy's carriers still ruled the seas, but the islands ruled the strategy. Each new airfield meant shorter flight times, stronger supply lines, and more pressure on Japan. And at the heart of that advance lay the same pattern: men, metal, and the will to make solid ground out of nothing. In letters home, Seabees wrote not about the battles they saw, but about the things they built. They joked that when the war was over, they could pave the Pacific all the way to Tokyo. They didn't realize it then, but in a sense they already had. The steel carpets of the Pacific were more than infrastructure. They were destiny taking shape, one mat at a time. The beachhead was made of black ash, soft, shifting, alive. It swallowed boots, tires, and hopes in equal measure. When the first Seabees landed there in February 1945, the battle was still raging only a few hundred yards inland. Mortars thumped. Japanese machine guns rattled from caves in the cliffs. The air was so thick with smoke and sulfur that men said it smelled like the mouth of hell. And into that hell, the Seabees carried their steel. They came with crates of mat, bulldozers wrapped in canvas, and orders from command. Establish a usable runway as soon as possible. The Marines needed fighter cover. The B-29s bombing Japan needed emergency landing fields. Every minute without an airstrip cost lives. So the Seabees did what they always did. They started building. The black sand made it almost impossible. It shifted under weight, refusing to hold shape. Bulldozers sank to their axles. Men used planks and shovels to free them. Each mat they laid sank almost immediately, swallowed by the ash like quicksand. They cursed, sweated, and worked until their hands bled through their gloves. Nearby, mortars fell so close that the ground trembled. One detonation sent a load of mats flying into the air like shrapnel. When the dust settled, one engineer shouted over the noise, "Well, the Japs are helping flatten the ground for us." That was the gallows humor that kept them sane. It took 48 hours for the first runway to take shape. They called it Airfield Number 1. It was barely 1,500 feet long, uneven, and scorched at the edges, but it was enough. On February 22, 3 days after the initial landings, a damaged P-51 Mustang limped in from the north, low on fuel and trailing smoke. The pilot barely cleared the ridge before touching down on the new steel runway. The men cheered as the plane skidded to a halt, sparks flying from its wheels. The pilot climbed out, trembling, and said simply, "Didn't think anyone could build heaven out of this." By the end of that day, 11 more crippled aircraft had landed. Each one that touched down meant another crew saved from ditching in the sea. The Seabees didn't stop. They built through bombardments, through night, through exhaustion. The sky was an inferno, but their hammers never paused. When the wind shifted and blew the smoke away, the island's black volcanic slopes shimmered, not with lava, but with steel. The mat had turned hell into a haven. As the war pushed closer to Japan, the challenges grew deadlier. At Okinawa, the final great battle of the Pacific, engineers found themselves working under almost constant attack. The Japanese had turned the skis into suicide. Kamikazes came in waves, diving on ships and airfields with terrifying precision. On one such day, a Seabee named Walter was laying mats at Airfield when a plane came screaming down toward them. It crashed less than 100 yards away, the explosion throwing him flat. When he stood up, dazed, his first instinct wasn't to run, it was to grab a replacement panel and keep working. "We were so used to it," he said later. "If we stopped every time something blew up, we'd never finish." That was the reality of their war, a rhythm of danger and construction, destruction and repair. Every new mat they placed was a statement. You can bomb us, burn us, bury us, but we'll still build. By then, the mat had evolved. Early versions rusted quickly in the salt air, so the engineers developed coatings of zinc and asphalt paint. Some mats were even made of aluminum alloys to reduce weight. Others had new locking systems to make them faster to assemble. The result was astonishing. At Okinawa, 400,000 panels were laid in less than 2 weeks. The Seabees built not one but 7 airfields across the island, each capable of handling B-29s and transports. The sound of those steel runways being built became so constant that even in battle, men stopped noticing it. One Marine said that when the hammers stopped for even a few minutes, it felt wrong, like the world had gone silent. But the noise wasn't only physical, it was symbolic. For the Japanese defenders, the metallic clanging was like the ticking of a clock counting down to the end. Each echo meant another American airfield closer to their homeland. By April 1945, the nearest bases to Japan and Okinawa had become massive hubs of air power. Fighters, bombers, and transports filled the skies. The Pacific was now a network of steel arteries, each one feeding the next battle, each one built from those same perforated sheets that started in Alabama. In less than 3 years, the U.S. had transformed an ocean into an airfield. Yet even victory came at a cost. The men who built those runways rarely saw headlines. Their work didn't make newsreels or inspire recruitment posters. They were ghosts in the background, silhouettes against the sun, building, fixing, rebuilding again. Many never returned home. Engineering units lost hundreds to artillery, snipers, and air raids. Some died of exhaustion, others from tropical disease. At Okinawa, when the final airfield was completed, the surviving Seabees held a small ceremony at dusk. They lined up along the runway, their boots clanging softly on the steel. A chaplain spoke briefly, his voice drowned out by distant thunder. Then, as if on cue, a formation of P-47s roared overhead, the planes they had built the field for. The men watched silently, their faces glowing in the reflection of the engines. One said, "You can hear the war ending in their engines." He wasn't wrong. By August, when Japan finally surrendered, the mat had covered the Pacific like a web. More than 2 billion square feet had been produced during the war, enough to stretch from San Francisco to Manila and back. It was the unsung hero of the island-hopping strategy, the invisible backbone of victory. And when the shooting stopped, the steel carpets didn't disappear. In the post-war years, they became part of the peace they had helped create. Many runways built from mats became permanent airfields. Others were torn up and reused for roads, warehouses, even makeshift homes. Some panels were sold to farmers who used them for fences and bridges. In the Philippines and on Guam, entire villages grew up around those steel leftovers. The war's bones turned into foundations for new life. Still, for the men who laid them, the sound of that steel never quite faded. In the years that followed, many veterans spoke about the memory that haunted them most, the clang. That constant metallic rhythm became the soundtrack of their war. In their dreams, they could still hear it hammer on steel, echoing through the tropical air. It wasn't a sound of destruction, but of persistence, of creation in the middle of chaos. One Seabee, interviewed decades later, put it simply, "Every time I hear a hammer hit metal, I think of those islands. I think of how we built something solid in a world that was falling apart." By the end of 1945, the Pacific was quiet again. The airstrips lay empty under the sun. Grass began to grow through the holes in the steel. Crabs scuttled across them. The echo of engines faded into history. But the mat had done its work. From Guadalcanal, too, it had carried the war forward one sheet at a time. It had turned mud into might, fear into foundation, and chaos into order. It was never glamorous, it was never celebrated. But it was everywhere the victory was built. The Pacific War ended not with silence, but with the hum of engines coasting to a stop. Across the islands, from the coral plains of to the volcanic slopes of, the sky was suddenly still. The bombers returned one last time, their bellies empty, their missions complete. On the ground, the runways still shimmered. Rows of mats stretched into the distance, by rubber scorched by exhaust, but intact. They had endured the weight of thousands of landings and takeoffs, typhoons, bombardments, and the unbearable heat of the tropics. Now they waited unused, unneeded, like monuments to a vanished urgency. In the first months after the war, the Pacific Islands transformed. The military called it demobilization, but for the men who had built those islands out of steel and sweat, it felt like a strange kind of erasure. The Seabees were told to dismantle what they had created. One by one, the bases closed. The steel panels that had once defined the front lines were up and stacked again, waiting to be shipped home. Crates of mat lined the beaches like metallic tombstones, waiting for new orders that never came. In Guam, whole airfields were stripped bare. On Saipan, bulldozers pushed mountains of mats into the sea. It was like watching history sink, one engineer recalled. But not all of it vanished. On some islands, the locals begged the Americans to leave the mats behind. They had become part of daily life, used to repair docks, reinforce roads, or patch craters in the landscape. On one small atoll in the Marshalls, the villagers built an entire fishing pier out of them. Another used them as roofing, cutting the panels into sheets and fastening them over palm rafters. The steel that once carried warplanes now carried life. Back in the United States, the factories that had forged those same planks shut down or converted to civilian work. Bethlehem Steel returned to making bridges and trains. Inland Steel went back to automobiles. But in the minds of engineers and architects, the legacy of the mat didn't fade. It had proven something extraordinary, that infrastructure could be portable, modular, and immediate, that roads and runways didn't need permanence, only purpose. The concept began to reshape post-war thinking. In 1946, at a construction conference in Chicago, an Army engineer held up a section of mat during a presentation. He said, "This is more than steel. This is time made tangible." His audience, architects, industrial designers, and engineers, understood. The war had created an entirely new philosophy of building. The world had learned how to make civilization move. Across Europe, U.S. occupation forces used leftover mats to rebuild bombed-out cities. They became the first roads in devastated towns, the floors of refugee camps, the foundations for new housing. In Berlin, American engineers used thousands of them to pave the grounds of airport, allowing cargo planes to deliver supplies during the Berlin airlift. Every package of food that landed there, every life saved, touched that same perforated steel that once rested on Pacific beaches. In the Middle East, oil companies bought tons of surplus panels from the U.S. government. They used them to create instant runways for survey planes and temporary roads through deserts where nothing could support a truck. A U.S. Army report from 1948 called the mat the most important piece of engineering material since concrete. And in a sense, it was. It wasn't just a tool, it was an idea. The simplicity of its design inspired post-war industries around the world. The interlocking principle became the basis for everything from prefabricated bridges to modular flooring systems. The holes that once served to drain rainwater became the model for storm-resistant designs in peacetime construction. Even the shipping industry adopted its logic. Standardized container panels, the precursors to modern shipping containers, borrowed directly from the mat's modular philosophy. Build fast, ship anywhere, assemble on site. In the quiet years after 1945, engineers who had once built runways on coral reefs now worked for civilian firms, designing airports, highways, and industrial zones. Many carried the same mindset they'd learned in war, that nothing was too remote, too barren, or too unstable to be built upon. They called it expeditionary engineering, and it became the backbone of Cold War construction projects around the globe. In the Pacific, the remnants of those wartime airfields slowly merged back into the landscape. On the steel rusted red against the black sand. On grass grew through the holes, turning the runways into fields again. But in aerial photographs taken years later, you could still see the ghost lines, faint geometric scars across the islands, traces of where the steel had once lain. Some locals refused to let them fade. On a small island in Micronesia, the villagers painted their remaining mats white and used them to create a community square. When asked why, one elder said, "Because the steel remembers." It did. Even after decades of storms, some panels remained almost intact, a testament to the quality of their construction. They had been designed for weeks of use, yet they had endured for generations. The legacy reached further still. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the first engineers to land at Incheon carried the same kind of panels, updated versions of the mat. They built runways, bridges, and supply roads in days, repeating the miracles of the Pacific. Vietnam, 2 decades later, saw yet another generation of the same invention. Now called M2 matting, the panels were lighter aluminum-based, but their DNA was unmistakable. The same pierced pattern, the same interlocking joints, the same philosophy, make ground where there is none. A pilot landing at Da Nang in 1968 described the sensation as, "You could hear the clank of history under your wheels." Even NASA borrowed the idea. When the space race began, engineers at Cape used style steel flooring for their mobile launch platforms. The modular design allowed them to assemble and reassemble sections of the launch complex quickly, an echo of the Seabees' work on distant Pacific islands. From bombers to rockets, from coral to the stars, the same logic endured. Humanity had learned to build against the impossible. But for the men who had laid the first steel carpets, the invention's legacy was something more personal. They saw in every runway a memory of sweat, exhaustion, and the desperate hope that what they built would last. In 1955, a group of Seabee veterans returned to Guam for a ceremony marking the 10th anniversary of the war's end. They were older now, heavier, quieter. The jungle had reclaimed much of what they'd built. But when they reached the old airfield, they stopped. Beneath the vines and grass, patches of steel still gleamed. One man knelt, brushed away the dirt, and tapped the metal with his knuckles. The same sharp ring echoed faintly through the humid air. He smiled. "Still here," he said. The others nodded. They didn't need to say anything else. History remembers the planes, the ships, the generals, and the battles. But beneath all of them lies something quieter, the ground they stood on. And in the Pacific War, that ground was not dirt or coral or concrete. It was steel. It was the sound of thousands of men turning chaos into order, one clang at a time. It was the mat, the steel carpet that carried a war across an ocean and left behind not destruction, but the blueprint for how humanity could build again. The war had ended, but for the men who built its foundation, peace was not silence. It was an unfamiliar sound. For years, the Seabees had lived by rhythm. Hammer on steel, engines roaring, orders shouted through wind and salt. Now the islands were quiet. The waves rolled where bombers once thundered, and the steel carpets they had laid, their greatest creation, were being swallowed back into the earth. For many, the silence was worse than battle. In 1946, Chief Petty Officer Thomas Mack returned home to Ohio after 3 years in the Pacific. He had built airstrips on Tarawa and Okinawa, places that didn't even exist on his pre-war maps. When he stepped off the train in Cleveland, the streets felt wrong. Too still, too solid. "I kept waiting for someone to yell, 'Move it,' or for an engine to start," he said in a letter to another Seabee. Instead, there was only the hum of peacetime. For a while, he tried to forget. He found work in a steel mill, familiar smells, familiar heat, but even there something was missing. "The steel here doesn't mean anything," he told her once. "It just sits still." For men like, motion had been purpose. The war had taught them to build on shifting ground, to make stability out of chaos. Civilian life, with its routines and permanence, felt strangely fragile by comparison. Across the country, thousands of returning engineers, welders, and builders found themselves haunted not by combat, but by creation. They had seen the impossible, islands rising out of the sea, jungles turned into cities overnight. They had been gods of construction, working with a kind of divine urgency. And now they were just men again. The Navy called it readjustment disorder. The men called it stillness sickness. One Seabee veteran, interviewed in 1948, said, "When I hear rain hit a tin roof, I see the Pacific. When I hear a hammer on metal, I want to start laying panels. We built the world faster than we could understand it." The mat had not only changed how they built, it had changed how they thought. Many of them carried fragments of the war home, literally. Some brought back small pieces of mat as keepsakes. They used them as garden fences, garage ramps, even porch flooring. The steel rusted, but it didn't break. Decades later, in towns across America, you could still find those panels, relics of a time when the future was made of iron and sweat. For others, the mats were ghosts. In dreams, they saw endless runways stretching into the horizon, the clang of hammers echoing forever. One veteran described it as walking on steel that never ends. The psychologist who treated him wrote that the patient suffered from constructive recall, the mind reliving the act of building under stress. But the man himself had a simpler explanation. "You can't forget what you made out of nothing." Back in the Pacific, not everything faded. On the massive airfields the Seabees had built were still in use, now by commercial and transport aircraft. The same mats that once launched bombers toward Japan now carried cargo and civilians. Local workers learned to maintain them, replacing rusted panels with new ones, sweeping sand from the joints just as the Americans had. In some places, Islanders gave the old runways names in their own languages, words that meant path of iron, field of thunder, or the floor of giants. To them, the steel was not a relic of war. It was the first step toward connection, the thing that had brought the modern world to their shores. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the Seabees themselves were slowly becoming legend. Hollywood made films about them, The Fighting Seabees in 1944, You're in the Navy Now in 1951. But those stories focused on the action, not the endurance. They showed explosions and courage, not the slow, grueling miracle of building under fire. The real Seabees laughed at the movies. They forgot the mud, one said. Yet even as their fame faded, their influence deepened. Civil engineers across the country adopted wartime methods into post-war planning. Temporary housing, highway construction, portable bridges, all drew inspiration from the same principles that had guided the Mat. Wherever America built, whether in the Arctic, the desert, or the jungle, echoes of the Seabees methods followed. Their legacy wasn't loud, it was foundational. In 1952, a reunion was held in San for veterans of the naval construction battalions. Hundreds attended, some in crisp suits, some in worn overalls, many carrying photographs of the islands they had built. At one table, a man named George Smith unfolded a faded map of the Pacific. It was covered in penciled lines, every island he had worked on. "Each line," he said quietly, "is a runway we made. If you lay them end to end, they'd circle the world." A younger man asked him if he ever wanted to see them again. Shook his head. "No," he said, "they're where they belong, out there holding up the sky." But time, like the tide, erases even the strongest steel. By the late 1950s, most of the original mats had been buried, rusted, or replaced. New materials, aluminum, reinforced composites, took their place. Yet in quiet corners of the Pacific, the old panels still surfaced. After typhoons, islanders would find them washed up on beaches, their edges smooth from years in the sea. They called them ghost roads. Fishermen used them to repair boats. Farmers used them as plows. Children played on them without knowing that those rusted sheets had once carried bombers across the ocean. The war had ended, but its bones still lay close to the surface. In a small town in Texas, a retired Seabee named Frank kept one mat panel mounted on the wall of his workshop. He had cleaned it, painted it black, and hung a brass plaque beneath it that read, "The ground beneath victory." When visitors asked what it was, he'd smile and tap the metal with his wrench. That, he'd say, is the sound of the Pacific War. He wasn't exaggerating. To him, and to thousands like him, that sound had become memory itself. The clang of steel was the heartbeat of a generation that built the world faster than it could destroy itself. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Mat wasn't in what it built, but in what it revealed. The human capacity to create stability in chaos, to find order where none exists. In the Pacific, surrounded by destruction, men had made runways that led not only to victory, but to understanding that civilization is something we construct, piece by piece, even in the ruins of war. And though the steel rusted, the idea did not. Every modular shelter, every emergency airstrip, every relief bridge laid after a disaster, they all carry the spirit of the Seabees' invention. They all whisper the same truth that echoed across the islands in 1943. Build fast, build strong, build hope. Years later, a journalist visiting Guam found an old section of runway still intact near the coast. The panels were orange with rust, overgrown with vines. Nearby, an elderly islander sat repairing fishing nets. When the journalist asked him if he knew what the metal was, the man nodded. "War Road," he said, "it made the planes fly." The journalist asked if it should be preserved, cleaned, restored. The man shook his head. "No," he said, "let it stay, it's part of the island now." And he was right. The Mat had begun as a weapon of war, but in the end, it became something far more enduring, a bridge between destruction and rebirth, between past and future. It was not just steel, it was memory woven into the earth. By the dawn of the Cold War, the world had changed, but the lessons of the Pacific still echoed in steel. The Mat, once a battlefield necessity, had quietly become the blueprint for a new kind of power, the power to build anywhere instantly. Where empires had once conquered with guns, the new superpowers would do it with infrastructure. In 1950, when the Korean War erupted, the first U.S. engineers to step off landing ships at Incheon carried more than rifles. They carried steel. The beaches were chaos, tides rising 20 feet in hours, mud thick as glue, artillery raining down. But within days, the Seabees had laid the first strips of portable runway. It was a familiar rhythm, shouts, hammers, clangs like an echo of Guadalcanal, or the same perforated panels, the same interlocking grooves, the same urgency. A photograph from that week shows a group of young engineers kneeling in the mud, bolting the panels together while shells burst in the distance. The caption reads, "They don't dig in, they build up." The phrase became an unofficial motto. By the time the UN counteroffensive reached Seoul, steel mats had been laid across half the peninsula. They became not only runways but bridges, supply depots, even shelters. The same steel that had carried bombers to Tokyo now carried medics, refugees, and food. As the Cold War expanded, the logic of the mat spread with it. In 1955, U.S. engineers in the Arctic began constructing DEW line radar stations, early warning sites against Soviet bombers. The ground there was frozen tundra. Concrete would crack in hours. So they turned to the same idea, modular steel platforms. They called it Arctic matting, but the lineage was unmistakable. Pierced panels, lightweight, fast to assemble, just like the ones that had once rested on Pacific sand. For every new threat, the solution was the same. Build fast, build smart, build temporary but strong. What began as improvisation in 1942 had become a philosophy of global logistics. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was watching. In 1957, when they began constructing remote airfields across Siberia, their engineers used a nearly identical system, corrugated steel plates bolted edge to edge. Soviet design manuals even referenced American expeditionary flooring as an example of wartime efficiency. In a strange way, the invention that once symbolized American mobility had become a shared language between enemies. Both sides had realized that control of the future depended not on who held the most territory, but on who could build fastest on it. But the mat's reach went beyond war. By the 1960s, humanitarian organizations had begun adapting its concept for disaster relief. When an earthquake hit Chile in 1960, the most powerful in recorded history, U.S. Navy engineers arrived within days. They laid portable runways and docks using lightweight aluminum versions of the mats, allowing supply planes to land in regions where roads had been wiped out. It was the same act as before, transforming chaos into connection. A Chilean engineer who witnessed it said, "It was like watching order descend from the sky." The technology born in blood was now saving lives. As the 20th century accelerated, the idea of modularity became civilization's signature. Prefabricated housing, container shipping, modular hospitals, all owed a quiet debt to the mat. Every bolt, every panel, every click-fit connection carried its DNA. Even the space age wasn't immune. At Cape in 1961, when engineers designed the launch pads for the Mercury missions, they used steel flooring for the base structures, steel panels with drainage holes and interlocking edges. An engineer reportedly joked, "We're building the moon's first runway before we even get there." He wasn't far off. When the Apollo astronauts later trained for lunar construction, the mats used in their mock habitats were based on the same design. The war that had taught men to build on coral was now teaching humanity how to build on another world. Back on Earth, the philosophy of portable permanence began reshaping entire economies. In the oil fields of the Middle East, modular roads made of steel and aluminum allowed rigs to move across shifting sand. In Africa, relief teams built temporary airstrips in weeks, bringing medicine and aid to villages unreachable by road. In Antarctica, scientists built research bases atop metal grids modeled after matting, designed to flex with the ice instead of crack. Everywhere the ground refused to cooperate, the same principle prevailed: make your own. The mat had outlived the war that birthed it, but not its purpose. In 1965, Life magazine ran a photo essay titled "The Steel That Keeps Moving." The images showed Seabees in Vietnam laying M2 aluminum matting at Da Nang, soldiers unloading modular bridges in India, and a Red Cross field hospital being assembled on panels outside Calcutta. The caption under one image read, "From the Pacific to the Mekong, this is the sound of civilization, hammer against steel." The article ended with a quote from an unnamed Navy engineer. "We don't conquer anymore, we construct." It was both boast and prophecy. But with progress came forgetting. By the 1970s, few remembered the name Mat. The newer generations of engineers used plastic composites, pre-stressed concrete, and aluminum grids. They spoke of modular systems and rapid deployment units, unaware that their language was built on the ghosts of 1943. Yet the old veterans remembered. When interviewed by historians, they always returned to one word: immediacy. "You didn't wait," said one Seabee. "You didn't plan for comfort or beauty, you just built, fast, because if you didn't, someone would die." That urgency, that raw relationship between time and creation never left them. It became part of how they saw the world, not as fixed, but as something to be built and rebuilt forever. As the Cold War dragged on, the idea that once belonged to builders became the core of global defense. Portable runways for nuclear bombers, collapsible shelters for radar crews, instant bridges for tank divisions. All of it could trace its ancestry to that first shipment of perforated steel that left Alabama in 1942. It was as though the world itself had adopted the mindset of the Seabees: anticipate the terrain, master it, reshape it. The age of static empires had ended. The age of modular civilization had begun. And yet behind all the innovation and progress, there lingered something quieter, a moral question. Had the world learned the wrong lesson? Had the ability to build anywhere made it too easy to wage war anywhere? For every hospital raised on portable floors, there was a battlefield built the same way. For every refugee airstrip, another runway for bombers. One historian wrote, "The Mat gave humanity the means to construct peace or perpetuate conflict. It made both equally efficient." It was the paradox of progress. The same steel that had saved lives had also made it easier to take them. By the time man set foot on the moon, the lineage was complete. The lunar module's landing pads were designed using the same structural logic as the old steel runway mats: lightweight, load distributing, adaptable to unstable terrain. When said the surface is fine and powdery, and the module held steady, it wasn't just a victory for space exploration. It was, in a way, the final triumph of a wartime invention, a piece of the Pacific reborn in lunar dust. From coral to moon dust, the same principle endured. To survive, build where no one believes you can. And so, even as the Cold War faded and the world turned toward peace, the ghost of the Mat lived on in every emergency shelter, every temporary airstrip, every bridge built after disaster. It was no longer a weapon of war, but a promise that even in the worst chaos, humanity could still create structure. Steel had learned to carry more than planes. It could carry hope. By the end of the 20th century, the war that had birthed the Mat lived only in fading photographs and in the memories of men whose hands had once built the world out of steel. The Pacific was quiet again, the beaches green with life, the airstrips long reclaimed by grass and coral. But if you looked closely from above, the ghosts were still there, faint rectangles etched into the earth, traces of runways that had carried the weight of victory. And in quiet homes across America, the men who had laid those runways, the Seabees, the builders of the impossible, sat with those ghosts every day. Chief Thomas Mack, the same man who had once built airstrips on Tarawa, kept a rusted piece of mat propped against his porch wall. Visitors thought it was scrap metal. He knew better. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he'd tap the steel with his cane and listen to the sound it made, that hollow metallic ring that once echoed across the Pacific. "Still sings," he would say softly. To him, that sound was more than memory. It was proof that something he'd built had lasted, that even when history forgot, the steel remembered. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of, a handful of surviving Seabees returned to the island. They were old now, gray-haired, slow-moving. but still carrying the same stubborn pride that had once driven them through smoke and chaos. The U.S. Navy had erected a memorial on the edge of the old airfield, a stone marker engraved with the words, "They built for peace through war." When the veterans arrived, the airstrip was overgrown. Grass sprouted through the rusted panels, and the jungle had reclaimed the edges. The ocean whispered only a few hundred yards away. One man knelt and ran his fingers over the corroded holes in the steel. "These same mats," he murmured, "were under the gay." He paused, his voice trembling. "Imagine that. We built the runway that carried the bomb that ended it all." There was no pride in his tone, only weight, the realization that creation and destruction had always shared the same foundation. Later that day, as the veterans gathered in a small ceremony, one of them, a wiry man named Harold Red, spoke without notes. "We didn't carry rifles," he said. "We carried wrenches, shovels, and hammers, but we fought the same war. Every runway we laid was a promise that no matter what was falling from the sky, someone would be there to build something solid beneath it." The men nodded quietly, some wept. In the decades that followed, as the last of the World War II builders faded away, historians began to realize what they had left behind was not just steel or infrastructure. It was a philosophy. The idea that stability can be made anywhere. When the tsunami struck Indonesia in 2004, UN relief teams built temporary airfields using lightweight modular mats, direct descendants of the design. In Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, the same principle was used again to build roads and landing zones in a matter of days. And when floods struck Pakistan and wildfires swept Australia, modular steel and aluminum systems were deployed once more. The same interlocking teeth, the same rhythmic clang of assembly, the same echo of the Pacific. The tools had changed, but the music was the same. One of the last Seabees of World War II, a man named Daniel, watched the coverage of those relief efforts on television from his home in California. He was 92. When he saw workers laying modular panels from helicopters, he smiled faintly. "Still at it," he muttered, "still building on bad ground." His granddaughter asked what he meant. He pointed at the screen. "That's what we did, that's what we always did. You make the world steady one sheet at a time." As the years went on, even the word began to fade from memory. The steel itself had outlasted its name. But the concept it carried, that fusion of engineering and endurance, seeped into every corner of modern life. The same logic runs through disaster shelters, space stations, field hospitals, even the digital infrastructure of the internet, modular, redundant, designed to work anywhere. The world had inherited the Seabees' way of thinking. Build for motion, build for change. Build so the next generation can stand where you couldn't. In 2017, a section of original mat was recovered from an overgrown airstrip on. It had lain buried in mud for 70 years, but when cleaned, its surface still gleamed faintly, the zinc coating stubbornly resisting time. Engineers studying it remarked that it was as functional today as it was in 1944. The mat was sent to a museum in Washington, D.C., and displayed under a simple plaque that read, "The ground beneath victory, Mat, Pacific Theater, 1942-1945. Visitors often walked past it without noticing, but those who stopped and looked closer saw the dents, the scorch marks, the fingerprints of history pressed into its skin. One plaque beside it quoted a line from an anonymous Seabees diary. "We never stood still, the war didn't let us, so we built the ground to stand on." Today, in the 21st century, the world's armies, aid agencies, and builders all carry descendants of that idea. Rapid deployment runways, refugee housing grids, modular roads in deserts and polar stations, all born from that same seed. Every time steel teeth click into place, every time a helicopter lands on a makeshift platform in a flood zone, the spirit of those men lives again, in the hammer's ring, in the rhythm of teamwork, in the belief that there is no such thing as impossible ground. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the mat, not its material but its meaning. It taught humanity something that no general, no weapon, no treaty ever could. That civilization is not inherited, it is constructed. Piece by piece, panel by panel, clang by clang, From coral to cosmos, from war to peace, the steel carpet of the Pacific carried more than planes. It carried the proof that in even the darkest moments of destruction, humanity's instinct is not to break, but to build. In the final years of his life, Daniel would sometimes sit on his porch and listen to the sound of construction from a nearby highway expansion. Trucks rumbled, cranes clanked, men shouted through the noise. He'd smile, close his eyes, and whisper to no one in particular. "Still building, that's good." Then he'd tap the small strip of rusted mat that sat by his chair, a piece of the past that still caught the sunlight. And for a moment, as the sound of hammers carried through the wind, the Pacific was alive again. The steel was singing. The builders were home,